What would you do if, in the middle of a raging wildfire, a towering creature placed its fragile child into your hands and collapsed right before your eyes? The truth few people know is that Bigfoots have a way of marking safe shelters for their young. 3 deep knocks on wood. And that night, those knocks echoed outside her cabin. She was Martha, a former combat nurse in Vietnam. She had witnessed countless deaths, but never imagined she would one day save a Bigfoot. In this story, you'll see how she kept it alive through a brutal winter, how it learned to bark just to call her, and how it came back, risking its own life to save her family during a devastating flood. That night, Asher, now grown and strong, led her to a mountain crevice, using its own body as a bridge so she could pull her injured dog from the raging waters. By morning, it was gone, leaving only its massive footprint in the snow. If you skip this story, you'll never know how a Bigfoot can love and repay a human, and why Martha still believes it's watching Ovan that October night. The wind tore down the mountainside like a living thing, carrying with it the sharp sting of smoke and the crackle of burning timber. The fire had been creeping for hours, but now it roared, painting the ridgeline in furious orange. Martha's coat snapped in the gusts as she and Sheriff Clyde drove the cattle out of the lower pasture, their flashlights cutting pale arcs through the swirling ash. Somewhere behind the wall of smoke, the forest was breaking apart, trees moaning as they gave in to the flames. And then, through the chaos, came a sound that didn't belong. A low, rasping breath, uneven, almost human, tangled with a deep, guttural rumble. Martha froze. Her eyes found movement under a half-charred oak, its branches black and skeletal against the firelight. Something enormous crouched there, half in shadow. The air shimmered with heat between them, but she could make out the slope of massive shoulders, the glint of amber eyes reflecting fire. In its arms, a smaller figure shivered violently, its thin whimper swallowed by the roar around them. The creature, taller than any man she'd seen, lowered itself to one knee. Martha realized it was shielding the smaller one from the wind, its fur singed at the tips, skin beneath marred with burns. Slowly, with a deliberate care that felt almost ceremonial, the massive hand lifted the small bundle forward. The weight settled into her arms, warm, trembling, and far too light. Martha looked up, meeting those eyes again. They held something she hadn't expected. Not fear, not rage, but a deep, weary sadness, as if the whole of the mountain lived in them. Then the creature sagged forward, strength gone, body collapsing into the smoke. Her grip tightened around the small life pressed to her chest. She could feel its heartbeat, a weak, rapid flutter against her ribs, and the faint damp of breath against her collar. Clyde was shouting her name, but his voice was distant, lost under the crackle and the roar. The fire was rolling closer, its heat biting at her face. She turned, boots sinking into the soft earth, and ran. The wind clawed at her back, ash stinging her eyes, each step a fight against the sucking mud and the push of air. The creature in her arms whimpered again, a sound so fragile it cut through the chaos like glass. The path to her cabin felt twice as long, the familiar turns warped by smoke and shifting shadows. She could hear the groan of timbers in the distance, the snap of branches falling. Overhead, sparks spiraled into the night, drifting like brief, dying stars. Her porch light glowed faint through the haze, a beacon in the dark. She kicked the door open, the hinges screaming, and stumbled inside, the sudden stillness of the cabin almost startling. The only sound now was her own breath, rough and uneven, and the faint, uneven rhythm of the heartbeat under her palm. She dropped to her knees before the hearth, laying the bundle on an old quilt, hands working without thought, pulling another blanket around it, stoking the fire higher. The glow fell over its face, revealing features she couldn't name, something between wild and fragile, skin shadowed under the flicker of flame. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to hold its breath, as though the mountain itself was watching. Martha didn't know what this was. Not yet. All she knew was that whatever had happened out there in the fire, whatever this thing in her arms truly was, it had been entrusted to her. And out in the darkness the forest burned on, the wind carrying embers toward the next ridge, promising that tonight was far from over. By morning the smoke had thinned to a brown haze, but the cabin held a hush that made every board creak sound louder. The little one wouldn't eat. He swallowed air like it hurt, a thin, hitching sound that came and went in pulses. Martha warmed goat's milk on the stove, tested it on her wrist, and fed him with a teaspoon because anything more sent him into a shiver. He was light as kindling in her lap, warm but fragile, a heartbeat that kept arguing with the world. Bram understood before she asked. He nosed the quilt, circled once, and lay down so close his ribs brushed the creature's arm. The dog's heat seeped into him. Breath by breath, the tremor eased. Martha draped a wool blanket over both. The oil lamp lifted a soft halo around them, the kind that made time feel slower, like the room was holding its breath too. All day it snowed ash. By dusk it was only sky, a slate lid dropping over the ridge. Martha counted spoonfuls and minutes. She kept the kettle on. She laid clean towels near the stove and set out a bowl of warm water to wipe the soot from his face. Up close, he was not a child and not an animal she knew. A map of delicate bones under a fine down of hair, a brow too expressive to ignore, fingers that curled around the handle of the spoon and then forgot why they'd done it. She whispered his name in her head, though she had not said it aloud yet. She only knew that losing him would feel like losing the last light in a long winter. Bram rose only to drink. Each time he returned, he tucked himself tighter against the small body and watched the door like a sentry. The stove ticked. The wind combed the high pines and made the chimney moan. Somewhere out there a single tree went down with a slow, ancient crack. When the little one dozed, the lines at the corners of his mouth smoothed, and Martha saw the echo of another face by the burning oak, the heavy eyes that had met hers before giving up. Grief had a weight. It sat in the room with them. On the third night, the air changed. Snow started in fine grains that made the lamplight look like it held a swarm of tiny stars. The temperature dropped hard enough that the window panes crisped with frost. Bram's ears pricked. Martha felt it in her chest before she heard it. 3 measured thumps against the outer wall. Not a knock in the way people knock. A deep, hollow sound that traveled through timber and bone, spaced the way a heartbeat spaces silence. She didn't rush the door. She tucked the blanket higher, added another stick to the fire, and let the second set of 3 come. Same rhythm, same restraint. She unlatched the bolt and opened to a darkness that felt thick enough to press back. The yard lay under a powder of new snow, and the beam from her hand lamp turned every flake into cold glitter. No figure on the porch, no breath on the wind. Only a trail of prints on the far edge of the light, wide, long, cleanly cut. And then nothing beyond, as if the forest had swallowed whoever made them whole. Martha listened for the old panic and found a steadier thing moving in its place. She shut the door gently, relatched it, and stood until the shiver in her hands passed. Bram settled once she did. The little one stirred and reached out, not quite awake, finding the dog by touch like a child reaches for a nightlight. The rhythm of the cabin returned. Fire, breath, wind, breath. A small sound at the edge of sleep. Come morning, Pastor Elias stopped by with a sack of groceries and a thermos of coffee too strong for most people. He took in the tired under Martha's eyes and the hush of the room. Then the prints at the eave line where the snow held them perfectly. He didn't smile. He didn't joke. In his quiet, practical way, he told her what he'd heard from elders up the valley. Stories that weren't his to own, but had been trusted to him all the same. When one of the forest children is placed in human arms, The others mark the shelter. 3 knocks, repeated. A sign they've seen, that they're near, that this place is a circle they will keep. It's also a warning to men who take what isn't theirs. Someone is watching, and the woods remember. He set down the thermos and put a hand on the door frame as if he could feel the echo still caught in the grain. Then he asked nothing else. He left her with canned peaches, gauze, and a promise to stop by again after the road crews cleared the switchbacks. All day the snow deepened. Martha fed by the spoon and measured out hours in the length of the lamp's burn. She swept the porch clear so new prints would show. She placed a second latch on the back door and turned a nail into a peg beside the bed so the flashlight would live there, easy to find in the dark. Bram napped with one eye half open, that sentry rhythm never quite letting go. By twilight, the first set of prints had filled into soft hollows. The yard looked untouched again, the way a confession disappears once it's offered. Inside, the little one swallowed 2 more spoonfuls without flinching, then sagged into sleep with his palm against Bram's chest. Martha sat in the rocker, hands open on her knees, listening for a pattern she now understood. When the wind fell, the silence felt like a held note. 3 slow thumps rolled through the wall just after the lamp began to gutter. Not demand, not threat. The same careful cadence as before, as if someone outside was saying, "Remember we are here. Remember what you carry." She stood and didn't open the door. She didn't need to. She looked toward the window where the frost had made a lace of the glass, and for a long moment she had the clear sense of being seen, and, stranger still, being counted among the living things the ridge meant to protect. The fire settled. The lamp steadied. Out past the tree line, something moved and was gone, and the night held its breath again, leaving the smallest echo to work its way through the timber, down into the floorboards, and into the place in her chest that had been empty for a very long time. She called him Asher on a morning the sky came up clear and cold, the kind of blue that makes smoke look like a thread pulled from the hills. The name fit before she said it out loud. Born from ash, carried from fire, a promise that something could start again where something else had ended. He watched her mouth form the sound, curious, eyes bright under the fine down at his brow. And when Bram answered with a single short bark, Asher tried it too, an awkward little burst that startled him and made Martha laugh for the first time in days. After that, when he needed her, he'd give that quick, clipped call, and she would answer from the stove, from the yard, from the porch steps where she mended old gear in the thin winter light. It became a rhythm in the cabin, a question, a reply, a life stitching itself back together. Under the oaks, the world felt different. The fire had passed weeks ago. The first snows had crusted and melted, and the ground was a patchwork of frost and a deep rust-gold carpet of leaves. The canopy thinned into lace against the sky. Martha walked them there to get sun on their faces and weight into their legs. Bram ranged ahead, nosing at acorns and watching the shadows in that way dogs do, ready to shut it all down if anything felt wrong. Asher followed, loose-limbed and unsure, learning his own length, testing where the world pushed back. When Bram darted, Asher chased. When Bram stopped on a dime, Asher did not. He careened, tripped over his feet, and went down with a surprised huff that wasn't quite a cry. He lay there blinking at the canopy as if the trees had done this to him. Bram jogged back, planted his paws, and hooked a foreleg around Asher's wrist like a big brother pulling a kid off the playground gravel. Asher watched the move, then copied it clumsily on Bram, palm to fur, a small tug that meant we're not done. They tried again, and again. Leaves lifted, spun, caught in Asher's hair and in Bram's ruff. Martha stood at the edge of the clearing with her hands tucked into her sleeves and felt the cold on her teeth when she smiled. For a few long minutes, grief stepped back and let the day be only what it was. 2 creatures teaching each other how to run. Asher learned fast. He learned the shape of the porch boards that warmed first in the sun, the scrape of the kettle lid when milk was ready, the particular squeak of the back latch, and he learned the difference between Bram's alarms. One bark, short, for come. Two in quick succession for watch it. A low rumble when a coyote cut across the tree line, which Martha answered with the snap of the yard light and the calm weight of her voice. Asher began to mirror more than sound. He watched how Bram tilted his head to listen, how he touched Martha with the back of his paw so he wouldn't scratch, how he lay long ways by the stove to share heat, leaving room for a second body if the night got mean. One morning, a thin mist held to the low places, and the creek carried the last of the snowmelt like a bright ribbon through dark stones. Martha called, and Asher's little bark came back from the trees, faint and eager. She found him down by Hollow Creek, squatting by the water, eyes fixed on a black oak just off the bank. His hand rested on the trunk, not pressing, simply touching like he knew the tree was older than the cabin and older than the road that brought supplies once a month. The bark bore a carving, clean and deliberate, a double spiral no storm could have made. Two coils, side by side, turning inward and out, a shape that pulled the eye and held it. She stood with him for a long breath, the creek throwing light up into the oak's scars, and felt a pressure in the air she couldn't name. Not dread, not comfort. Something that said, "Pay attention." Asher traced the spiral with his fingertip as if he had always known it, then placed his palm flat to the mark and looked toward the ridge. The gesture was small, but the meaning landed heavy. She put her hand on the same mark alongside his. The trunk was cold. The groove was smooth where hands had found it before. Pastor Elias came by that afternoon with a pry bar for a stubborn window and a tin of salve for Bram's cracked paws. Martha showed him the oak. He didn't bring a story like a campfire tale. He brought it the way a man carries news he respects. "Old marks," he said, "older than the county lines and the names on the maps. Not writing in the sense we know it, but a sign all the same. Two spirals tied close means not alone. It means the family is near and claims this space as a threshold. It tells the ones who belong how to move, and it tells the ones who don't that there are eyes on them." He said it the way he'd say a forecast. Not a warning exactly, but a change in the weather you'd be a fool to ignore. On the walk back, the quiet pressed in different. The oak leaves whispered even when the wind died, and the ridge seemed to carry messages from one fold to another. Bram caught the tone first. He shifted his patrol wider, touching each edge of the yard as if redrawing a line the snow had smudged. Asher moved within it, testing his voice, that short call growing clearer, something like confidence in the way he stood. Martha felt the cabin tilt around a new center that was not quite inside and not quite outside, the place between. As dusk came down, the creek kept its silver. The spirals in the bark held their dark. Asher ate a little more and slept a little deeper, one hand unconsciously opening and closing against the blanket as if he were still touching the tree. Martha sat by the window with the lamp turned low and watched the yard until it blurred. She could feel the story reaching past the fence line, laying track in the woods where she could not see it yet. Out there, beyond the last of the oaks, something answered Bram's patrol with a patience that didn't feel human or hostile, just present. The night breathed, the ridge listened, and the small sound that called her from the doorway, one quick bark, sure of itself now, told her the next day would not be the same as the last. By the time the smoke cleared off the ridge, the town had already turned the story into something it could hold in its teeth. At the Ridgeview Tavern, where the friars never slept, and the neon beer sign blinked like a tired eye, men leaned over long necks and said they'd heard a woman up Hollow Creek had taken in a thing from the fire. Not a calf, not a black bear. A something. They argued measurements like fishermen, 7 feet, 8 when it stood straight, and laughed the way people do when they're a little afraid and don't want to be. That's when Roy Cutter pushed through the door with a cold on his back and a grin that looked stapled in place. He said he'd trapped bears out of Glacier and a cat that took 2 darts to put down. He said there were buyers now, real ones, not the drunks with cell phones. He tapped his phone anyway, showed a message thread full of promises and dollar signs. "You bring it in alive," he told the room. "You won't have to buy your own beer in this county again." Sheriff Clyde was there for a burger and a bad cup of coffee. He didn't argue. He watched which faces turned hungry and which went quiet. He paid his tab and took the winter road up the switchbacks with his hazard lights flicking in the mist. Martha met him on the porch. She had a wool cap pulled low and a tiredness that started in the eyes and worked down. He didn't waste time. He told her what he'd heard, what was growing in the tavern air like mold, the way men with empty months in front of them like to fill those months with a story you could load into a truck. He told her about Roy, where he'd be, what he'd bring, the smell of lure oils that followed him like cologne. He said he could take her to town for a few nights. He said he could put a cruiser at the end of her road. Martha looked past him into the trees, the oaks furred with frost, the creek throwing a thin thread of silver through the brown. She shook her head. The refusal wasn't hard. It was steady. Leaving would say the ground belonged to whoever wanted it more. And Asher was learning the sound of her steps on these boards, the feel of Bram's breath on his shoulder when he slept. This place had been chosen, marked, and she would not move him like a box of jars. Clyde didn't push. He just nodded once and told her to keep the yard light on and the phone charged. Then drove slow back down the road, tires whispering on the ice. She started with what she could control. The old woodshed at the stand of furs still held the smell of apples from a fall 15 years gone. Its door sagged, but the walls were tight, and the roof didn't leak more than a drip. She swept it out, laid a thick bed of straw, hung a wool blanket to hold heat, and ran a length of rope from a beam to the ground so Asher could grip it the way he liked to when he fell asleep. Bram tested every corner, snuffling, then chose the space nearest the door and dropped there like a sack of muscle with a beating heart. Martha rubbed resin into the hinges to quiet them and set a new padlock high where a hand needed to know the trick to find it. She spread wood ash along the threshold because her father had taught her to read a line like a ledger. What passed, when, whether it ran or crept. At dusk, the ridge went the color of steel. She cooked, fed by spoon, listened. The creek made its small constants. The yard light bled a circle of weak gold into the snow. Out past that, the dark held its own counsel. The 3 knocks didn't come, but the sense of being counted did, as sure as the way the hair lifted on her arms before a storm. Bram's patrol shifted, a wider loop, a pause at the driveway, a long look into the firs. Asher's call, one quick bark, came once and then not again. He was settling. The woodshed breathed with them, a second heartbeat on the property. Roy moved like a man who knew fences in the dark. He smoked downwind and crushed the butt beneath his heel where the ash line would take it. He kept his truck a quarter mile off and walked the rest with a pack that clinked softly. Chain, a loop of cable, a small pry bar. None of it heavy, all of it mean. He didn't believe in stories. He believed in money. Sometime after midnight, the temperature dropped like a trap door. Frost climbed the nails in the window trim, and the lamp flame drew tight. Bram came up hard from sleep with a bark Martha hadn't heard from him yet. A rip of sound from the chest, teeth in it, not a warning so much as a charge. She was on her feet before she knew where she was. Boots, coat, flashlight. The world outside hit her lungs like glass. Snow had dusted the yard since 10. Now the prints were there, fresh and moving fast. Boot treads cut deep toward the first stand, and a second, smaller set skittered over them. Bram, launched and gone. Martha ran. The beam jumped wild and caught a glint of metal at the edge of the light, then lost it. She heard Bram's snarl break and reform, as if he'd hit something that fought back with hands. The woodshed door stood open. No splintering, just open, the padlock sagging on its hasp, tongue torn clean from the staple with a practiced twist. Straw churned, blanket ripped, the rope dark with something wet. Snow trampled into the shape of a scene she couldn't see yet. She stepped in, and the smell told her faster than her eyes did. Blood, sharp and tinny. Not a lot, but enough to mark a struggle. A smear along the low board where something had been dragged or had tried not to be. A dark thread leading out, across the threshold, into the open where the wind would take it soon. She called Bram once. The night answered with a yelp that cut short and the whip of a chain against a post. Not her chain, not anything she owned. Farther off, a man's breath, hard and satisfied, then soft again, like he knew there were things on this ridge that didn't need to know him yet. The flashlight's circle swung wild across fir trunks and came to rest on a patch of crushed snow, shaped like a body that had gone to its knees and then been heaved up. The absence inside that outline was louder than any sound. Martha stood very still. The light shook once in her hand and then steadied. The ash line at the threshold held a new story. Boot, 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 dog, drag. And there, barely there, the faintest edge of a print too wide for a man, pressed into the powder at an angle as if someone had stepped in, paused, and then stepped back into the trees. The wind lifted. The yard light hummed. Somewhere on the road below, a truck shifted into a lower gear and kept going. Not fast, not slow, just sure of its way. The night closed around the cabin, the shed, the torn rope, taking shapes and keeping secrets, and what had been safe an hour ago was now a promise she had no choice but to chase. Dawn scraped pale over Hollow Creek, and Martha followed the story the snow wouldn't stop telling. Boot treads, a drag line, the bite mark of a steel chain stamped and lifted, toward the old logging road that crossed the ridge like a scar. Bram limped beside her, blood dark on his hind leg, breath coming in white, ragged bursts. Every few yards he stopped and looked back at her as if to say, "We don't have time." She wanted to call Clyde. She wanted a cruiser at the turnoff and a pair of cuffs for Roy Cutter. But a headline and a cage could come faster than help, and once a thing like Asher became a trophy, he would not leave one. She turned them home first. Bram's leg shook under him. In the kitchen, she cut away the matted fur, cleaned the gash with warm water and iodine, wrapped it tight with gauze and an old strip of flannel. He licked her wrist once, apology and permission. She packed a thermos, a coil of rope, a crowbar, and the 30-30 that had belonged to her father, the wood smoothed by a lifetime of use and storms. She left a note on the table for Pastor Elias in case the road ate her. Then she shouldered a pack that felt like a decision and stepped back into the cold. Roy thought the highway made you seen. He took the ridge road instead, ruts frozen hard, and switchbacks shiny enough to swallow trucks who didn't respect them. The chain rattled against the bed of the pickup, metal on metal, a sound that made the back of his neck itch. In the mirror, he could see the shape hunched under a tarp, wrists crossed and locked to a loop welded into the floor. Not crying, not fighting like a bobcat, breathing slow in a way that unnerved him. Money sat in his future like heat off August dirt. Buyers texted him ranges and guarantees. He thought of new tires, a better rifle, a winter with a full fridge. He rolled down the window for a smoke and watched ash blow into the pines. Martha picked up the truck at the cut bank where the snow was churned into gray frosting. She walked the shoulder, eyes on the small tells, a cigarette filter pressed into a heel print, a drip of oil like a trail of black berries, the scuff where someone had slipped and then righted himself with a hand. She moved steady, not fast, because haste lost people. Bram kept pace with his weight off the bad leg, stubborn as an oath. The ridge flattened into a saddle where the road widened just enough to turn a pickup if you knew how. That's where the air changed. As the truck crested, figures stepped out from the tree line, the way shadows decide to take bodies. They didn't rush. They arranged themselves across the higher slope, tall and still, a row of dark mass against the white. Eyes caught light and returned it in a dull gold that looked older than the snow. Roy hit the brakes hard enough to fishtail, skidded sideways, and punched his shoulder into the wheel to bring the truck straight. He reached for the rifle out of reflex and remembered he'd left it on the passenger seat for show back at the tavern. He grabbed a pistol instead and fired twice into the open air because thunder sometimes moves animals. The ridge didn't flinch. The echoes rolled out, found nothing, rolled back. In the bed, Asher lifted his head. The chain tightened and rang. The figures did not advance. They watched. The snow sifted between them, unbothered. Roy cursed, slammed the truck into reverse, and stopped it, tires shrieking against ice. The rear wheel skated, caught, leaped. The tarp slid. The chain slackened. One more jerk and the padlock he'd bought from the farm store, with its nickel shine and proud packaging, failed the way cheap metal fails when cold and fear meet it just right. The shackle snapped. The loop gave. The truck lurched free and threw a rooster tail of powder into its own wake, fleeing the ridge with taillights blinking red like a lie. Silence came back in layers. Asher sat up slow, skin marked where steel had kissed too long. He put a hand on the rail, tested his feet, and climbed down. Not graceful but sure. The line of dark figures remained. A few shifted weight. One lifted its chin toward the far fold of the hills, a small gesture that moved more than sound. Asher did not look toward the road that led to a porch light and a quilt, and the smell of goat's milk on the stove. He turned his face to the cut of trees the gesture named. Something older than language passed between slope and body. He stepped into it and was gone in 3 strides, the woods taking him like a door that knows its own. Martha found the bed scars and the broken padlock at the wide place. She found the imprint of a small body that had sat and then stood, the clean heel of a palm pressed once into the snow as if to say here. She found the faint half-moons of larger feet along the tree line, prints that didn't bother with the road at all. She called his name and the sound snagged on the spruce and fell back soft. Bram whined low, the kind of sound that comes from somewhere below pain, then leaned into her knee, asking which way. She could follow. She knew that. But following into a circle that wasn't hers would cost more than distance. The sky thickened to the color of lead. A few flakes turned to many. Roy's tire tracks filled, then blurred, then smoothed like a secret finally satisfied. Martha picked up the broken shackle and put it in her pocket because it mattered to hold the thing that had failed. She looked once more into the trees where the dark had arranged itself into a gate and let the knowledge land, heavy and right. Asher had not been abandoned. He had been summoned. The ridge breathed. The creek below kept its silver in the last light. She turned toward home with Bram hobbling beside her, and the snow began to erase the road behind them as if the night wanted fresh ground for whatever would happen next. 2 months later, the valley changed its voice. Rain came hard for 3 straight days, cold and unbroken, turning Hollow Creek into a brown, roiling thing that chewed the banks and spat branches like bones. The old plank bridge at the bend shuddered under the flood, nails groaning, boards flexing, and then it gave with a sound that felt like the hill itself cracking. Martha watched from the porch as the water climbed the yard stake by stake. She kept Bram in, but a break in thunder lined up with a gap in her attention, and the door blew wide. He was gone before her shout reached the steps. By the time she hit the creek path, the rain was a curtain. She saw flashes. Bram leaping the last sound piece of railing, his back leg slipping, the weight of water grabbing him sideways. He didn't vanish. He fell into a pocket the flood hadn't found yet, a narrow ledge where the cliff wall pinched, 10 feet above the churn, 4 feet below reach. He scrabbled and held, claws gouging wet rock, eyes bright with panic he wouldn't give voice to. Martha lay flat and stretched and knew it was useless. The river threw spray in her face like fists. Night slid down early, the kind that shows no edges, The rain thickened. She ran home for rope, for a crowbar to wedge into something solid, for light. Somewhere between locking the coil against her chest and finding the door latch, the sound came again. 3 deep knocks in that measured cadence the cabin had learned to breathe with. She opened into a wind that pushed the rain sideways and found him on the porch. Asher stood in the spill of the yard light, taller by a head than the last time she'd held his face in her palms, near 7 feet, and built with a strength that looked earned, not gifted. The down along his brow had thickened into a coat dark with water, and his chest rose steady, not shivering, not weak. He wasn't alone. At the edge of the trees, where the light frayed into dark, another shape kept still, bigger, older, present like a held note. Asher didn't speak. He reached for her sleeve and tugged once, then turned and ran. They moved through a world narrowed to beam and breath. The creek roared like machinery. Trees leaned, whole root balls loosening in the soaked soil, sliding a foot and stopping. Asher led them off the main path to a cut she would have missed, a deer track that bent around a fallen cedar and descended in wet steps toward the pinch in the walls. When the water flashed in front of them, white with power, she heard Bram at last. One short bark, clipped and thin, the sound of a brave thing admitting the edge. Martha looped the rope around her waist and swallowed the shake in her hands. There was no anchor she trusted. The ground near the lip was all mush and slick rock. Asher stepped into the opening, planted both feet against the uphill face, and lowered his weight until his back found the cliff. He offered his arms the way a man offers a beam. She wrapped the rope around his forearm once, then twice, felt the tendon and the heat alive under the soaked hair. He took the line without looking away from the drop, hands closing until the rope cut a clean line across his palms. The other presence above shifted once, a cough of stone answering, as if the mountain itself had leaned closer. She went over the edge. The river reached for her. Cold climbs up the spine, breath stolen to the back of her teeth. The rope hummed. Asher didn't give an inch. She felt him through the line, his weight, his pulse in micro-shifts, his patience in the hold. The beam of her headlamp shook and found Bram pressed to the rock, shoulder wedged under an outcrop, the bad leg pinned. "Easy," she said out of habit, though the river ripped her words to threads. She set the crowbar as a lever, pried once, twice, and the rock grudgingly moved. Bram's body slumped into her lap with a sound like a sob swallowed. She clipped his harness to the rope and signaled up with a jerk. They rose inches at a time. The line creaked. The water threw tree limbs at their knees. Martha braced her boots on the wall and pushed, and the rope answered with steady draw. When her head came level with the lip, she saw Asher's face up close for the first time in months. Jaw set, eyes locked, rain carving paths through ash and mud. His hands bled where the rope had burned them. He didn't notice. He didn't blink until her chest cleared and Bram rolled onto the slick grass, trembling but alive. For a long beat they only breathed. The creek argued itself raw below. Thunder shifted into distance. The shape at the tree line remained, a dark patience holding the edge of the world together. Asher eased the rope from his palms like unspooling a memory, flexed his fingers, then reached for Bram and ran his knuckles down the dog's cheek with a delicacy that undid the rest of Martha's held breath. Bram leaned into it and shut his eyes. They made the climb back slow. The rain softened from fury to endurance, and the woods exhaled smoke from roots that had nearly gone. At the porch, Asher stopped at the bottom step and looked at the open door, at the square of light, at the stove she'd left burning low. The air between inside and out pulled tight as a tripwire. He turned instead to the dark where the watchful shape waited. He stepped closer as if to stand in 2 places at once, and knew he could not. 3 quiet knocks rolled through the rafters, not from the porch this time, but from the trees themselves. The sound carried through trunks and soil. Martha lifted a hand as if to touch his shoulder, and didn't. Okay, she said, the word for yes. Thank you. I know. Asher met her eyes once, a calm that held the weight of the flood and something larger than water. He tilted his head toward the ridge. When she looked back, he was already moving. The rain blurred his edges. Bram let out one small, certain bark. The old call, but deeper now. The night took the answer and saved it for morning. Before dawn, the storm ran out of words, and the cabin settled into the soft ticking of heat, returning to wood. Martha worked at the kitchen table with a towel and gauze. Bram draped across her lap like a child too heavy to carry, but unwilling to be anywhere else. The gash on his hind leg was clean now, pink at the edges where iodine had bitten. He shook once, all the way from chest to tail, and laid his head on her wrist as if to steady her hands. The stove sighed. Steam rose from a pot. Somewhere under the eaves, rainwater dripped a steady metronome. Asher stood near the door, a dark shape against the weak square of porch light. Water purled along his arms, hair clumped and glossy. He watched what her hands did. He watched the way Bram breathed through pain, slow and stubborn. Rope burns striped his palms, raw crescents where the line had carved. Martha reached for the tin of salve Elias had left and set it on the table without looking up. After a beat, Asher stepped closer. He held out the right hand first, the way a man offers a tool that needs care. She dabbed the salve and wrapped a strip of clean cloth around the palm, snug but not tight. His breath did not hitch. He turned his hand and she did the other. Bram lifted his nose and bumped Asher's wrist, a small thanks. The lamp guttered and found itself. Night thinned at the windows in the way it does when the sky is deciding whether to give up its dark. The creek still roared, but farther off now, like trouble moving down river to bother someone else. When she finished the last knot, Martha sat back and let her shoulders drop. The room held a hush that felt earned. For a moment it could have stayed that way, 3 bodies in one small box of light, each warmed by the next, but the ridge had its own clock. Asher turned his head toward the door, not sharply, not alarmed, just listening to a call that lived under the noise of rain and water. It wasn't the 3 knocks, though the memory of them lived in the cabin wood. It was quieter, a pull, the way a tide works under a calm surface. He looked to Martha, then to the latch, then back. She understood without understanding. They stepped onto the porch together. Cold cut their faces clean. Fog lay in bands along the yard like smoke that had lost its heat. The ridge was a gray shape, its lines softened to an old bruise. Asher stood beside her, close enough that she felt the draft of his breath against her sleeve. He had length now, weight, a steadiness that children do not have. The yellow in his eyes caught the porch light and turned soft, not animal, not entirely human. Something that belonged to these acres more than to her house. She thought of the double spirals carved into the oak by the creek. 2 coils turning in and out. The mark had felt like a map then, and it felt like one now. He wasn't the small thing she'd lifted from a quilt by a fire. He was of the ridge. He was of the marks and the watchers and the patience that had paused at her eaves, counting her among the living. Love didn't argue with that. It only stood beside it and kept its voice low. Bram limped to the top step and eased himself down with a grunt. He pressed his shoulder to Asher's shin and looked out like a veteran who had decided not to retire after all. The fog breathed. Somewhere a branch let go and fell, its cracks softened by distance. The porch boards under their feet remembered other winters, other leave-takings. Martha set her hand on Asher's forearm, the bandage coarse under her palm, and felt the warmth still held there from the fight with the river. He turned toward her then. Slow. Sure. He lowered his head until his brow met hers, the touch light as moth wings and somehow heavier than grief. The first time she had felt that gesture, a mother had given her a life to keep while fire ate the ridge. Now the same language said a different thing. Not goodbye, not stay. Something like go well, and I carry you, and you carry me, even when the trail splits. Her eyes stung, not from wind. She let them. He held the touch one breath longer and lifted away. He stepped back into the yard. The fog took him to the knees, then the waist. He paused once and looked over his shoulder with that amber glance that had always felt older than he was. She didn't move. She didn't call. She held every muscle still the way you do when a wild thing trusts you enough to look back. At the edge of the circle of light, his outline blurred. Then the outline learned the shapes of trees and was gone. Martha stayed on the porch until the lamp dimmed and the cold found her bones. Bram shifted and put his head on her boot, the weight of it a promise. The ridge breathed around them, not empty, not full, only awake. In the cabin, the towel on the table cooled. The salve tin clicked as it settled. Down at the creek, water kept arguing with stone, the kind of argument that lasts a lifetime and never quite ends. She went inside only when the window glass began to pale. She left the door unlatched for a long minute. An old habit turned ritual, then slid the bolt and banked the fire. Sleep would come hard and thin. Morning would draw a line where the night had been. And in the days after, the yard would keep its own counsel until it didn't. Until the ground decided to save a sign the way it sometimes does when a story wants to be remembered. 3 months later, winter loosened its jaw and let a little color back into the valley. The flood had taken the bridge and part of the bank, but it left the meadow behind the cabin intact, a patchy spread of field grass and stubborn clover that greened first where the sun held longest. Martha walked it with a shovel and a rake, turning shallow roots, tossing out the stones the frost had heaved up, working the ground the way a person combs a child's hair after a hard night. She cut back the brush along the fence line so Bram could run a clean oval without catching his healing leg. When she finished, the meadow was a wide, soft ring with a clear center, a kind of stage for an ordinary joy. Bram tested it like a man returned to shore. Slow at first, then with a surprising burst, ears wind-tipped, mouth open in a grin that had waited weeks to happen. He circled once, twice, then came to lean against her calf as if to say it would do. The cabin settled into new rhythms. She left the back door unlatched in the afternoons, so the warm air carried the smell of spruce inside. The yard light stayed off more often. In the morning she could hear Hollow Creek arguing with itself below the bend, the sound lower now, almost companionable. At the oak with the double spirals, snow had retreated to ragged collars around the roots, and meltwater wrote thin lines down the trunk like notes left by a quiet hand. She found herself stopping there without planning to, palm to bark, the way you touch a doorway when you pass because someone you love once stepped through it. Pastor Elias drove up on a Saturday with a sack of feed for the chickens she hadn't replaced yet, and a paper bag that clinked with jars of peaches he'd put up last August. He wore the same old canvas coat and the hat she'd teased him about every winter since the drought. They stood at the fence and watched Bram plot his course like a small engineer, adjusting his stride so the bad leg didn't complain more than it had to. Elias listened without interrupting while she told the shape of the last weeks, the quiet that felt held instead of empty, the way the 3 knocks had stopped and yet the sense of being counted hadn't. The mornings that arrived with the peculiar fullness of a waiting room no one rushed to leave. He didn't offer a story to fill the silence between sentences. He looked at the double spirals, at the yard, at the tree line where the ridge folded like a sleeping thing, and said, in a voice that didn't try to dress anything up, "Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the place your heart chooses to stay." He said it like a fact you can lean a ladder against. Then he changed the oil in her generator and tightened the gate hinge that had squeaked since the fire. When he left, he put his hand flat against the door frame the way he always did now, as if to greet the memory of the knocks without asking it to answer back. Night came early and clean. Frost edged the grass in silver, turning the meadow into a field of low stars. Martha made tea and left the mug on the porch rail until the steam thinned. Inside, she spread a quilt on the floor by the stove, and Bram collapsed across it with a groan of pure satisfaction, the sound a house makes when the wind finally dies. She wrote a note for herself, feed, nails, new waders for the creek, then crossed it all out and wrote nothing instead. Quiet had become its own kind of work. Just before dawn, she woke to that particular winter light that makes every edge honest. The thermometer on the porch read 28. A breath of snow had fallen, thin as sifted flour, a dust on the meadow and the steps. Bram pressed his nose to the crack in the door, then looked back at her with the face dogs use when they're asking permission they know they have. She opened. Cold found her ankles. They stepped out together. Bram's prints went first. Small moons pressed into the powder, an easy loop that curved toward the far fence post and back. Beside them, for a stretch of 8 or 9 steps, no more, lay another trail. Not heavy, not stamped with force, just present. A single line of impressions set wider and deeper than any man's boot. 4 foot broad, heel like the beginning of a story, toes spread as if the ground itself understood what was asking to be held. The stride was measured close to Bram's, as if someone had matched him, step for step, so he wouldn't run alone. The trail joined, kept pace, and then veered toward the oak. There the marks thinned as the snow thinned. 2 more prints, each lighter than the last. Then only the suggestion of a weight that had chosen to lift. Past the tree line, the frost held clean as glass. Martha didn't call out. The morning didn't need her to. She stood with one hand on the porch post and felt the old ache behind her ribs settle into something that could be carried. Bram trotted to the place where the tracks had turned and put his paw carefully into one of them, the way you place your fingers on the last note of a song to feel it hum. He looked back at her. She nodded once. He came and leaned against her knee and watched the woods breathe. Later, Elias would come by with a radio he'd repaired and a story about a coyote that had learned to open a trash can lid without a single rattle. She would laugh, and the day would go about itself. But for now, the meadow held a proof she hadn't asked for and hadn't known she'd needed. A signature the ridge had allowed. She poured tea and sat on the porch step, the mug warming her palms. The steam rising like a thin prayer, even she didn't hear herself say. Somewhere beyond the first fold of trees, a jay scolded and then thought better of it. The sun found the double spirals and turned them the color of old honey. A breeze moved through the firs and shook off a few bright crumbs of snow. She didn't say the name. She didn't try to keep the moment from ending. She let it be what it was, a kindness made visible and then gone. The prints would soften by noon. The frost would lift. Bram would sleep hard after his lapse. She would hammer a new nail into the fence and think about spring seed. And out there, where the ridge keeps its own counsel, something would pause at the edge of her clearing and listen for a porch light coming on, certain and unafraid, before it moved on again. Some stories stay with you not because of the noise they make, but because of the quiet they leave behind. This was one of those stories, where the heart learns that connection doesn't need to be explained, and trust can grow in the most unlikely of places. It reminds us that the world is not only divided into the familiar and the strange, the safe and the dangerous. Somewhere between those lines is a space where understanding lives, and in that space, kindness can cross any boundary, without asking for permission, without needing to speak the same language. It's easy to think of life as a series of arrivals and departures, people and moments coming into our lives, staying for a season and then moving on. But maybe it's not the leaving or the staying that matters most. Maybe it's the mark left in the in-between, the way we're changed by what we've been trusted to hold, the way love, real love, doesn't need ownership to be real. It doesn't need to cling. It just needs to recognize what is worth protecting and to stand by it for as long as it's meant to. Sometimes what we call loss isn't an ending at all. It's a transformation, the shape of something precious shifting into another form we might not understand yet, but that still carries the weight of meaning. The truth is, every act of compassion, every moment we choose to meet the unknown with open hands instead of closed fists, becomes part of a story far bigger than our own. And those stories, no matter where they travel, carry our fingerprints. Life will always find a way to remind us that we are not alone. In the whisper of wind through old trees, in the rhythm of footsteps that match our own for a little while, in the stillness after a storm, when the air feels clean again and the horizon looks just a little closer. Those reminders don't need to stay forever. They just need to come at the right time, to steady us, to remind us that we belong, not because we hold on to something, but because something chose to walk beside us. And so the world keeps turning, seasons keep trading places, and we keep carrying those small, unshakable pieces of truth. That kindness is never wasted. That trust, once given, changes both the giver and the receiver. That sometimes the most extraordinary connections happen far from the places we thought they would. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling this story all the way through. If it touched you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments, join the conversation, and if you'd like to walk through more stories like this together, don't forget to follow and subscribe, because there's always another story waiting just beyond the edge of the light.